So what I'd like to do is simply actually work through one of the chapter problems from chapter 12 so that we are sure about our understanding of that material. The first question at the end of the chapter there says, according to the ISLM model, what happens in the short run to the interest rate, income, consumption, and investment under the following circumstances? Answer using a graph. So we're going to work within our IS dead marker framework. So within our ISLM framework, what happens if the central bank increases the money supply? So the first one is, what happens if the money supply is increased, and in particular the things that we want to know about are what happens to the interest rate, income, consumption, and investment. So interest rate, income, consumption, and investment. So why don't you try that real quick to work out a basic response to that question and see what you come up with, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so we'll start with an equilibrium, and they'll say, well, what changes? If the central bank increases the supply of money, which curve shifts and how? Remember that the IS curve is primarily related to fiscal policy action, and the LM curve is primarily related to monetary policy action. So if the money supply is going to change, it's going to be a shift in the LM curve, and it's going to shift it out or down. That's how we like to think about it. Okay. So then what happens to our interest rate? It clearly falls. Output increases. So income increases. What about consumption? Consumption will increase. Right? When the interest rate gets lower, people save less. People spend more. So consumption increases. And when the interest rate falls, how does that affect investment? It should also increase investment. It's cheaper to borrow, right? And increased investment does what? Well, that also increases output. You're scowling. You okay? No. Sure. Okay. Okay. Next, what happens if the government increases government purchases? So let's start over. If there's an increase in government spending, what happens? The change in government spending affects which curve? Government spending is fiscal policy, so it's going to be associated with the IS curve. The IS curve is going to shift to the right. Because of the change in government spending, the IS curve shifts to the right. How much does the IS curve shift to the right? The change is equal to the change in government spending divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Remember, the government spends some money, and then whomever the government spends the money with takes that money and spends it again. So there's a multiplier effect that works its way through here. Now, as a result of this increase in government spending, what do we observe? Well, the interest rate goes up, income increases, consumption increases, but investment will decrease. Because investment decreases, the actual shift in Y, in total output, is less than the distance implied by the increase in government spending divided by the marginal, or minus the marginal propensity to consume. So there's this crowding out effect. The government spends some money, yeah, that's going to increase activity in the market, but in the meantime, because the interest rate has gone up, it's going to crowd out some investment, so the shift isn't going to be as big as it otherwise could have been. What if instead there an increase in taxes? So we would want to start over again. Yeah. If there's an increase in taxes, how does that work its way through? Well, a change in taxes is also related to fiscal policy. How much would the IS curve shift? To make this easier to see, I'm going to draw the first IS curve here, make this the second IS curve. And the shift is equal to the change in taxes multiplied by this term as a result, what happens? The interest rate decreases, income decreases, consumption decreases, but investment increases because the interest rate goes down. So again, the overall shift of the IS curve winds up being bigger than the change in Y because there's actually a crowding in effect of investment. If you want to encourage investment, you can raise taxes according to this model. That seems counterintuitive, which makes me skeptical of the model. After all, starting in 2016 and 2017, what happened to taxes? It went way down, and what happened at the same time is we saw a great increase in investment, such that the stock market went like gangbusters. Okay. How much of that's real, and how much of that is illusory? Well, if you have an opinion, you can certainly gamble on it by investing or shorting the market. There seems to be a lot of volatility in the market this week. I can't imagine why. the government increased government spending and increased taxes by the same amount? What would happen in that case? The increase in government spending shifted y to the right by an amount equal to dg over 1 minus mpc. The increase in taxes shifts, and this is we're talking about what happens to y here, question mark, all right? Well, that decreases output by dt multiplied by minus mpc over 1 minus mpc. If we say that g is equal to t, then we would get, let's just put g over 1 minus mpc minus g negative mpc over 1 minus mpc. All right, well, g minus g, I'm sure I'm doing my algorithm here. This is not g minus, this is minus, let's do it like this. Let's put the g on the outside, make this 1 minus, put g minus g, make this just minus. See this, factor out the g, we're left with 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So we're left with just g, because this is 1. Which would mean that the overall shift would still be to the right, but instead of being by the amount, dg times 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, it would just be by the change dg, so it would be smaller than it otherwise would have been. So they counteract, though there still is some increase in government spending. Output increases, but by less than the amount that G and T increase. So disposable income falls. As a result, consumption also falls. The interest rate rises, and that causes investment to fall as a result. Okay. Let's work through a different problem. Let's work through a problem that involves some arithmetic. and see if that arithmetic can give us any intuition about what's happening in these models. So suppose that we have an economy and we were actually given a consumption function for this economy, given some numbers here. So suppose the consumption function is C equals 300 plus 0.6 times y minus t. Investment is equal to 700 minus 80 R. Okay? And government purchases and taxes are 500 and 500. Okay. So, can you interpret the equations that I've put on the board so far? We have a consumption rate. What does this 0.6 seem to indicate? That's our marginal propensity to consume. So that means we're saving about 40% of our income. We also have an intercept on our consumption curve of 300. So that seems to be the minimum consumption level. What about investment? Investment is $700 minus 80 times whatever the interest rate is. Okay. So we've got a negative relationship between the interest rate and the total level of investment. We've got some government spending and some government taxation. Can we go from this information and draw an IS curve? What is the basic equation for the IS curve again? We have an IS curve that satisfies the idea that y equals some function of consumption, that is a function of output and taxes, plus some function of the interest rate and government spending. Can we plug and chug? I think we can. So then, for this term, we'll replace this equation. For this term, we'll replace this equation. For taxes, we can plug in 500, and for government spending, we can plug in 500. So what comes out? We get y is equal to 300 plus 0.6 times y minus t. And we can plug in for t 500, y minus 500, plus our function for investment, which is 700 minus 80 r, plus government, so plus 500. And now we can simplify. So 300 plus 0.6 y minus, what's 6/10 of 500? 500 times 6. So 300 minus 300 plus 700 minus 80 r plus 500. So here we have a 300 and another 300. Those cancel. So then y equals 0.6 y. I can collect these two terms, and I'll go minus 80 r plus 1200. Have I made any errors yet? I don't think so. So then I can subtract this from both sides, and I get 0.4 y equals 1200 minus 80 r. I can divide everything by 0.4. And I get y is equal to 3,000 minus 200r. Check my math. I think that's right. And then if we're going to draw an IS curve, well then an IS curve is a graph that has y and r in it.
Why did you divide by 0.4?
There was a 0.4 here. I
Oh.
subtracted 0.6 from both sides, which got me a 0.6y from both sides, so I got 0.4y to get y by itself. I divided through by 0.4.
I see.
Okay, so here we have an intercept of 3,000, which would actually be here, wouldn't it? Okay, and if y were 0, then what would r be? 200r equals 3,000. 2 into 30 is 15. Is our IS curve. So it has intercepts at 15 and 3,000. What do you suppose we're going to do next? I think it would be fun if we did an LM curve next. Fun is a relative term. Let's say that the money demand function is m over p equals y minus 200r. Suppose the money supply is 3,000 and the price level is 3. Okay, can we graph this? Sure, we'll say 3,000 divided by 3 equals y minus 200r. So 1,000 equals y minus 200r. Then y would be equal to 1,000 plus 200r. So we'd have an intercept here of 1,000. And for every 1r, we go over 200. So there's our LM curve. What's the equilibrium? We solved, this is our LM curve. We solved our IS curve and said that y was equal to what? 3,000 minus 200r. Well, to be lazy about it, I'll say that 2y is equal to 4,000. So that y is equal to 2,000. And when y is equal to 2,000, then 2,000 minus 1,000 equals 200r. So it's 1,000 equals 200r. So r equals What do you get? For R. Why not 50? Wow, 5. Okay. Then what we would want to do here is to play with this model a little bit and see what would happen. Suppose the government purchases are increased from 500 to 700. How does that affect the IS curve? Remember, for the IS curve, government's purchases are sort of exogenous. We had solved the IS curve and gotten that y is equal to 3,000 minus 200R. If we increase government spending from 500 to 700, we have to say, okay, then y is equal to, let's work this through again, 300 plus 0.6 y, 0.6 times y minus t, y minus 500. Plus, shouldn't have erased all of that. Go back to what 700 minus 80R. Plus 700 now. We work that through. So y is equal to 300 plus 0.6 y minus 300, thank you, plus 700 minus 80R plus 700. So these two again cancel. Let's just go ahead and say 0.4 y, move this over now, equals 1400 minus 80 R, and then dividing by through by 0.4 gets us y is equal to 3,500 minus 200R. Notice something. What was G before? It was 500, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Okay, and now it's 700. So the change in G is 200, right? Mm-hmm. But how far have we moved Y? 500. So that's because of the multiplier. So then our IS curve isn't going to intercept at 3,000 anymore. It's going to intercept at 3,500. The slope hasn't changed, has it? No, it's minus 200R before. So we've got IS2 here. Okay? And so what happens to the interest rate and the output rate? Interest increases, output increases. Let's find out how much. Okay, so here I'm going to change that to 3,500. So we get 4,500. Y equal 2y equals 4,500, which means that y is equal to 2250. So notice, how much does y change? Only 250. Well, it changes by an amount of 250, but G only changed by 200. Okay, and the change of the IS curve was actually 500. And the new interest rate would be what? 2250. 1250 divided by 200. Interest rate goes up to 6.25. Okay, so a change in government spending has all the consequences that our model predicted, and we see here that the magnitudes vary in the same way that we talked about as we walked through the model. Similar consequences fall out of making changes to the money supply to shift the LM curve. The rest of this is in problem 3 from the end of your chapter. If you want to work through that and then check with me about your response, about what you figured out, that's not a bad exercise. That's worth doing. From my point of view, it's worth doing. It helps you to become a little bit more comfortable with the model. Questions for me? So we should have another problem set coming out at the end of this week. Give you 2 weeks to complete it, and then one final problem set that should go out 2 weeks before the exam, so that I have time to grade it and get it back to you hopefully before you take the exam. To get into the material of chapter 15, what we're trying to arrive at is some sort of a rule that the Fed can use when it intervenes in markets using monetary policy. So one of the big debates has been, should the Fed be able to act at its own discretion, or should it be bound by a rule? The reasons for binding the Fed by a rule are to make their activities somewhat more predictable to people in the market. So if the Fed is constrained, then market participants can get involved with some foreknowledge of what's going to happen in the future. So then the Fed engages in order to achieve certain targets, and it articulates those targets to the market. Now, when the Fed comes out and says, oh, we're going to change our target, or we're going to change our strategy, markets almost immediately respond. Actually, the market probably already will have responded based upon rumors going around about what the Fed might do. Once the Fed finally makes its announcement, we might see a decrease in the volatility of market activity. But leading up to that, we should see some signals that the Fed is probably going to change something. What would seem like a reasonable target for the Fed? Now, I had you skip chapter 14. And chapter 14 has in it this concept of the Phillips curve, where for a long time it seemed like fiscal policy and monetary policy could intervene in markets so as to generate a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So the Fed was given a dual mandate. We want you to maintain price stability, and we want you to maintain low unemployment levels. And there was a tension there that some people believe that the Fed can't do both, that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. If we keep unemployment low, then it might be the case that inflation would go up. If we keep inflation low, that might increase unemployment. What to do? Well, today it seems like that tension is not as strong as it used to be, that keeping unemployment low and inflation low tend to work together in the long run. It really has to do with the time span. In the short run, yeah, we could increase unemployment by reducing the quantity supplied of money, or by increasing this, so that, oh boy. In the short run, we can increase the quantity supplied of money, increase inflation, and as a result, reduce the unemployment rate. But that would work its way through the market and eventually bring us back to what we've sort of called home, our long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay. So to start thinking through a dynamic aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we'd want to start thinking about output. And the text does it this way. It begins with a model of output that involves time. Because the major factor that can influence the Fed's dual mandate really is which time frame are we thinking about, the short run or the long run. And most people in the marketplace, involved in the marketplace, have some assumption about what they expect the inflation rate to be. Again, I really like the Cowan and Tabarrok model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, where in the short run aggregate supply, basically that is a function of expectations regarding inflation. So E of pi. And that if expectations about inflation adjust, that is how the short run aggregate supply curve shifts. So including time in the way that we think about all of this is really important. So output this year is a function of the natural rate of output. The natural rate of output really is simply this idea of the long run aggregate supply curve, or being on the frontier of our production possibility function. Minus some parameter, some number that is empirically understood of the relationship between the real interest rate and the natural rate of interest. This starts to frustrate me a little bit. In this model, the little r is implied to be the Fed's natural interest, the real interest rate as determined by the Fed. And that can vary from the quote-unquote natural rate of interest. Plus epsilon t. And what epsilon stands for is some random exogenous shock to demand. What kinds of things randomly shock demand? Well, from Keynes's point of view, animal spirits randomly shock demand. So again, this is our long run aggregate supply curve, the natural rate of interest. We're going to assume that alpha and rho are both greater than 0. Now then, if the real interest rate increases, what do we expect to happen? Well, when the real interest rate goes up, we understand that we get less borrowing. So we get less saving, less investing. And those together result in less output. So this negative sign here makes sense. Similarly, if the interest rate goes down, we also get less. We actually get more saving. If the interest rate goes up, we get more saving. And less consumption. Well, that also decreases output. So this negative sign is reinforced in two ways. The alpha here is describing how sensitive a change in R brings about a change in Y, or how sensitive output is to a change in the real interest rate. That's a t, little t by the way. So the greater that this alpha is, the more sensitive output is to interest. It's kind of an elasticity almost. How sensitive is this to a change in this? Again, to reemphasize this, E of T term is taken to mean an animal spirit, some sort of a shock to demand. Now, it's treated as a random variable. By random, then, what's implied is that you can't predict it. You can't plan for it, and you can't prevent it. So then, shocks to aggregate demand or output, right, are unexpected, unplannable, and unpreventable. So if there is a recession, it must have been completely unexpected, it must have been unplanned, there must not have been anything that could have been done to prevent it. It must have been caused by something outside of what the Fed and Congress are doing. Well, is that true? Definitely sometimes true. However, it can also be true that the Fed or Congress can do some things that generate recessions. Never intentionally, I would suppose, but quite often unintentionally. Activities by government and bank decision makers can bring about a situation where we're in a recession. So the Austrian perspective on the Great Depression is that it was caused by an artificial maintenance of an interest rate that was too low. That made money cheap and made it seem like a lot of projects were worth investing in that ultimately might not have been worth investing in because the real rate of return on them ended up being very low, lower than the rate at which the investors could borrow. That then created a lot of investment that was done poorly, or malinvestment. That malinvestment meant that there were a lot of resources, capital resources, and actual infrastructure tied up in real infrastructure that wasn't really very productive. So there was a lot of resources tied up in things that were not useful in consumption, causing a recession. And the idea of malinvestment again later, I just wanted to, for the time being, to point out that there's some debate about what this random shock might be, whether it's really completely exogenous or if it has endogenous causes. Okay. Now, if E of t is equal to 0, if R of t is equal to rho, then this term is 0, this term is 0, 0 times alpha is 0. If these two things are true, then the actual output experienced this year will be equal to the natural rate of output, our long-run aggregate demand curve. Long-run aggregate supply curve, I should say. So the Fed has to try to set the interest rate so that it is equal to the natural rate of interest. However, if there are random shocks that occur in the marketplace, the Fed can adjust its rate of interest away from the natural rate of interest so as try to maintain an output level that is equal to the natural level of output. Similarly, if there's a random shock and the Fed can't act, then instead the government can get involved by changing government spending or taxes so as to balance out whatever the random shock is to demand so that this term becomes 0 again, in which case then the Fed can maintain its interest rate equal to the natural rate of interest and still achieve a level of output equal to the natural rate of output. So again, this E term is the vehicle through which fiscal policy enters in. The R term here is the vehicle through which monetary policy enters in. You may recall the Fisher equation. Here we're going to complicate it a little. We're going to say that the rate of return on investment between today and next year is equal to the nominal rate of interest minus the expectations today about what the rate of inflation will have turned out to be a year from now. So messing around with these subscripts is important to produce an interpretation. The real rate of interest today is based upon the nominal rate of interest minus what today's expectations are about what the rate of inflation will have turned out to be for the year that's coming up, between now and a year from now. We're not making any expectations about what the inflation rate will have been last year. We already know. As a matter of fact, knowing what the rate of inflation was last year might help us to make predictions about what the expected rate of inflation will be next year. Oftentimes, if people expect things to stay the same as they were last year, and unless you've got other information, the best that you can know about what's going to happen next year is probably the same thing as what happened last year. So then, the actual inflation rate that obtained last year is a good guess about what inflation is going to be next year. But that's not the only thing that can affect inflation. I know I'm running out of time. Inflation for this year that's coming up can be articulated as the expectations a year ago about what inflation will have been this year, plus some measure of responsiveness of inflation to the deviation between actual output and natural level of output, plus some random supply shock. This is talking about what level of inflation we see in the world. The level of inflation we see is equal to what we expected the inflation rate to be. And given that the Fed hasn't done anything, supposing that the Fed hasn't done anything, the level of inflation can be influenced by shifts away from the natural rate of output. How much? How much will a deviation from the natural rate of output influence inflation? That's what this symbol is supposed to say. It's some amount. So take whatever this deviation is and multiply it by some number, and you get the inflation rate. This number would be something that we would discover through empirical analysis. This V of t term, V sub t term, is talking about random supply shocks. Remember, random supply shocks are best understood as real shocks that shift our long-run aggregate supply curve. So, a hurricane, a natural disaster, a bumper crop, an unexpected technological discovery. Any of those kinds of things will shift our actual rate of output away from what we would have thought to be the natural rate of output. Now, expectations can be self-fulfilling, which is to say, I think that inflation is going to go down. Well, if I think that inflation is going to go down, then I might lower my prices. Right? If in general I expect prices to go down, anticipating that I might reduce my prices so as to maintain my share of the market. If I reduce my prices, other people might also reduce their prices. If everybody does that, then this number will go down. And it will result in a lower rate of inflation simply based upon the activities of people and their expectations. That's kind of that animal spirits element again. Okay? I don't know how powerful that is empirically. I would suppose weak. And the reason I say so is that this is often called push-pull inflation or cost-push inflation. And it's used to talk about the ways that labor unions could have caused inflation in the past. I don't think, for one, labor unions aren't powerful enough anymore to create a situation where wages go up significantly. And even in the past when labor unions were strong, I think that it's a weak vehicle that in the long run can't be sustained. In the long run will self-destruct. So this is an adaptive expectations about inflation, because we change what we expect based upon what happens in the world. There's another that only takes these particular sets of things into the consideration when creating expectations about inflation. However, there's an alternative point of view called rational expectations. And the rational expectations point of view says people will take everything that's happening in the entire world into consideration when making expectations about the inflation rate going into the future. They'll think about everything. And as a matter of fact, any information that exists in the world will already be incorporated into prices that we're observing today. Right? And that's similar to the efficient markets hypothesis with respect to investment that we've talked about in the past. Okay, thank you very much.